Sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the only one telling the truth. The pen tapped against the glass table echoed through the boardroom like a ticking clock, sharp, controlled, impatient. Each click a signal that Jonathan Blake was running out of patience and possibly out of time, because across from him, 3 international partners sat stiffly in tailored suits, their expressions tightening with every mistranslated sentence, while the official interpreter stumbled again, voice uncertain, choosing the wrong word, the wrong tone, the wrong meaning, and turning what should have been a collaborative proposal into something that sounded dangerously close to a threat. And Jonathan felt it, that subtle shift in the air, that invisible fracture that could cost him $1 billion deal, the kind of deal that didn't just make headlines but reshaped markets. And still, no one in the room seemed to catch it in time. No one except the woman standing near the back wall holding a silver tray with 2 untouched cups of black coffee, slowly cooling, her presence barely acknowledged, her footsteps earlier unnoticed, her name unknown to most of the people sitting at that table. Emily Carter moved quietly, efficiently, setting down cups, adjusting coasters, existing in that careful space between visibility and invisibility, where service staff were expected to be helpful but never heard, seen but never remembered. And when she had first walked in 10 minutes ago, not a single head had turned, not even Jonathan's, because to him she was part of the room, part of the background, part of the silence that filled the gaps between conversations that actually mattered. But Emily had been listening, not out of curiosity, not out of habit, but because listening was something she had learned to do long before she ever carried a tray, her eyes steady, her posture calm, absorbing every word that passed between languages, every hesitation, every subtle misalignment. And when the interpreter translated the partner's phrase again, this time turning a respectful negotiation point into what sounded like an ultimatum, Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, just enough to feel the pressure, just enough to ground herself, because she knew exactly what had just been said, and more importantly, what had not been said. But the room didn't react yet, not fully, only a slight shift in posture, a faint narrowing of eyes from the man in the gray suit across the table, and Jonathan noticed that, his pen stopping mid-tap for just a fraction of a second before continuing again, faster now, sharper, because something was wrong, and he could feel it but couldn't quite see it, not clearly, not yet. And the interpreter continued, filling the silence with words that sounded correct but felt off, like a melody played just slightly out of tune. And Emily stood there, still, quiet, her heartbeat steady, her breathing controlled, knowing that stepping forward meant breaking an unspoken rule, the rule that people like her did not interrupt people like them, that voices like hers did not belong in rooms like this. And yet the words hung in the air, heavy, incorrect, dangerous in their subtlety. And Jonathan leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, scanning the faces across from him, calculating, adjusting, trying to salvage control before it slipped. And that was the moment the room shifted again, almost imperceptibly, as if waiting, as if something unseen was about to happen. And Emily lowered her gaze briefly to the coffee cups, then lifted it again, calm, certain, no hesitation left, because sometimes silence protects you, but sometimes it costs too much. And she could already see the deal unraveling in real time, one wrong sentence at a time. The pen stopped mid-tap, not because Jonathan Blake had found the answer, but because the silence had changed. It was no longer passive, no longer empty. It carried weight now, the kind that pressed against the room without making a sound. And for the first time since the meeting began, his attention shifted away from the interpreter and landed, briefly, on the figure standing near the back wall, the waitress who had not moved, who had not spoken, who should not have mattered. And yet something about her stillness felt different, deliberate, as if she were waiting for a moment that no one else could see. And across the table, one of the international partners leaned forward, his voice calm, but firmer now as he responded in his native language, each syllable measured, each word precise. But when the interpreter spoke again, the meaning bent, subtle but unmistakable, turning a statement of flexibility into something that sounded like resistance. And Jonathan felt it immediately, the deal slipping another inch out of alignment, his jaw tightening, his mind recalculating, because billion-dollar negotiations did not collapse in dramatic explosions, They unraveled quietly, one misunderstanding at a time, and he could not afford that. Not here, not now, not after 6 months of preparation. And yet the words kept coming, slightly off, slightly wrong, like a compass that had lost true north. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft shift in the air as Emily Carter took a single step forward, barely enough to be noticed, her voice low, steady, controlled. "Sir, may I clarify something?" And the room froze, not because she raised her voice, but because she did not, because it was unexpected, out of place, almost inappropriate, the kind of interruption that did not belong in a room where every seat at the table had been earned through power or position. And Jonathan turned fully this time, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, really meeting them, not as background, not as service, but as a person who had just crossed an invisible line. And for a second, no one spoke. The interpreter went silent. The partners exchanged brief glances, and Emily did not rush to fill the gap. She simply held her ground, calm, composed, her hands now resting lightly at her sides instead of gripping the tray, as if she had already made the decision and accepted whatever came next. And Jonathan studied her, measuring, skeptical, because control was everything to him, and this was not part of the plan. This was not part of any plan, but there was something in her expression that did not ask for permission. It offered certainty, and that was rare, even in rooms like this, especially in rooms like this. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting just enough to signal a choice. "Go ahead," he said, his voice controlled but edged with curiosity. And Emily nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before turning slightly toward the partners, her posture straight, her tone respectful. And when she spoke, the language flowed differently, not rehearsed, not hesitant, but natural, precise, carrying the original intent with clarity that cut through the confusion like clean light, correcting the nuance, restoring the meaning, aligning the conversation back to where it should have been. And as the words settled into the room, something changed again. The partners relaxed, just slightly, the tension in their expressions easing, and Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not in doubt this time, but in focus, because what he was hearing was not just correct, it was exact, and exactness was the difference between profit and loss, between agreement and collapse. And for the first time that morning, the room felt stable, not because of the man at the head of the table, but because of the woman who had just stepped out of the background and into the moment that no one else had been able to hold. The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a room correcting its own balance after nearly tipping too far, and Jonathan Blake felt it in the way the partners across from him leaned back instead of forward, in the way their eyes no longer carried that guarded hesitation, but something closer to cautious agreement. And Emily Carter did not rush her words. She did not try to impress. She simply continued, translating not just the language, but the intention behind it, smoothing over the fractures that had formed minutes earlier, restoring clarity where confusion had almost taken control. And the interpreter, now silent, sat frozen with his notes in hand, as if unsure whether to step back in or disappear entirely, while Jonathan remained still, watching, listening, recalculating everything he thought he understood about the situation, about the deal, about the woman standing only a few feet away who had just done in seconds what his hired expert had failed to do all morning. And when Emily finished the final sentence, her voice fading gently into the air, she did not linger. She did not look around for approval. She simply paused, waiting, allowing the words to settle where they needed to settle. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to question. The meaning had landed exactly where it was supposed to, and one of the partners gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before responding again in his native language, his tone lighter now, more open, and Emily listened, just as carefully as before, her focus unwavering, before translating once more with the same quiet precision. And Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the table, no longer tapping, no longer restless, because for the first time since the meeting began, he was not reacting, he was following her lead, her timing, her understanding of the conversation that had suddenly become the most reliable element in the room. And that realization unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because control had always been his advantage, his identity. And yet here he was, relying on someone he had not even noticed 10 minutes ago, someone who had entered the room without a name, without a title, without any visible authority, and yet had just redirected a billion-dollar negotiation with nothing more than clarity and composure. And as the discussion continued, the rhythm changed, no longer fragmented, no longer strained, but steady, aligned, moving toward resolution instead of collapse. And Jonathan's gaze did not leave her now, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition, because what he was seeing was not luck, not coincidence. It was skill, practiced, refined, undeniable. And when one of his senior executives leaned slightly toward him, whispering a quiet question about whether they should resume with the official interpreter, Jonathan did not even look away as he responded, "No," his voice low but firm. "We continue like this," and the decision settled over the table with quiet authority, not announced, not debated, simply accepted, and Emily gave no visible reaction to the shift, no sign that she had just been placed at the center of a deal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. She only continued, sentence by sentence, word by word, holding the space with a calm that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. And somewhere between the next exchange and the one after that, Jonathan understood something he had not expected to learn that day, that the most dangerous mistake in a room full of power was not underestimating your opponent. It was overlooking the person who was never supposed to matter at all. Time did not slow, but it felt different, steadier now, as if every second carried direction instead of doubt. And Jonathan Blake could see it in the numbers projected on the screen, in the subtle nods exchanged across the table, in the way the conversation no longer circled uncertainty but moved forward with quiet certainty. And Emily Carter remained exactly where she stood, not stepping closer to the table, not inserting herself beyond what was necessary, translating only when needed, never interrupting the flow, only guiding it back when it drifted, her voice measured, her tone neutral, never drawing attention to herself, yet becoming the axis everything now turned around. And with each exchange, the deal rebuilt itself piece by piece, clauses clarified, intentions aligned, expectations reset, until what had once been fragile now felt structured, deliberate, real. And Jonathan found himself no longer anticipating mistakes, but expecting precision, an unfamiliar shift that both impressed and unsettled him, because he was used to being the most prepared person in the room, the one who saw ahead, who corrected others, who controlled outcomes, and now he was watching someone else do it with a kind of effortless discipline that did not ask for recognition. And that contrast lingered in his mind even as the meeting approached its final phase, when the lead partner leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but no longer guarded, and spoke at length, outlining the final terms, his tone calm, almost collaborative, and Emily listened, her focus unwavering, before delivering the translation with the same clarity that had carried them this far. And when she finished, the room fell into that same silence again. But this time it was not tense, it was full, complete, waiting for a decision that no longer felt uncertain. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting from the documents in front of him to the people across the table, and then, briefly, to Emily, who stood quietly, her hands relaxed at her sides, as if none of this had anything to do with her, as if she had not just redirected the entire trajectory of the negotiation. And that contrast settled something in him, a realization forming not in words but in understanding. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, but different. "We agree," he said, and the response was immediate, not dramatic, not celebratory, just a series of nods, a few exchanged glances, and then the subtle but unmistakable shift that marked the closing of something significant. And documents were gathered, signatures prepared, the formalities of success unfolding with practiced efficiency. And yet, Jonathan did not reach for his pen right away. He paused, just for a moment, his attention returning once more to the woman who had made this possible. And for the first time since she had spoken, he allowed the silence to extend, not because he needed time, but because he was choosing it. And when the papers were finally signed, the deal sealed with ink and intention, the room exhaled as one, a quiet release of tension that had been building for hours, and people began to stand, to gather their things, to return to their roles, their titles, their expectations, and Emily stepped back, just as quietly as she had stepped forward, moving toward the edge of the room, reclaiming the space she had occupied before, the space where no one looked twice, where no one asked questions, where no one expected anything. And Jonathan watched that, the way she transitioned without hesitation, without pride, without even a glance back. And something about that stayed with him more than the deal itself, because power he understood, success he expected, but this quiet precision without recognition, this ability to change everything and then disappear again, that was something else entirely. Something he had not been prepared to encounter. And as the room emptied, he remained where he was for a second longer than necessary, his mind no longer on the numbers, but on the voice that had cut through them, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that had left no room for error. The room emptied in layers, not all at once, but in quiet departures marked by the soft shuffle of polished shoes and the muted closing of leather folders, each person returning to a world where titles mattered and outcomes were expected, and Emily Carter moved with them, not ahead, not behind, just within the flow, carrying her tray once more, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the past hour had been nothing more than another shift, another task completed without consequence. And she did not look back, not at the table, not at the signed documents, not at Jonathan Blake, who remained seated for a moment longer than anyone else, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the contract, his gaze distant but focused, replaying something that did not fit into his usual calculations, because success, to him, had always followed a pattern, preparation, execution, control, and today that pattern had been interrupted, not by failure, but by someone he had not even accounted for, and that realization stayed with him as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he applied to everything in his life, before turning toward the door, only to pause when he saw her again, near the hallway, placing empty cups onto a service cart, her movements efficient, quiet, practiced, and for a brief second, he considered walking past, letting the moment remain what it was, an anomaly, an exception, something to be filed away and forgotten, but something in him resisted that, not curiosity alone, but recognition, the kind that does not ask permission, and so he changed direction, his steps measured, deliberate, until he stood a few feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to respect the boundary she had never crossed, and Emily sensed it before she saw him, the subtle shift in presence, the quiet stillness that followed, and when she looked up, her expression did not change, no surprise, no expectation, just acknowledgement, calm and steady, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no script for this, no defined role to follow, just two people standing on opposite sides of a moment that had already passed but had not yet settled, and Jonathan was the first to break the silence, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried in the boardroom. "What is your name?" he asked, not because he needed to know, but because he realized he should have known already, and Emily held his gaze for a second before answering. "Emily Carter," her tone even, respectful, but not deferential, and he nodded once, as if confirming something he had just learned rather than something he had just been told, and his eyes studied her, not in the way he evaluated employees or partners, but in a way that suggested he was recalibrating, adjusting an understanding that had been incomplete. "You are not just a waitress," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Emily's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be easily defined. "I serve where I am needed," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer lingered longer than he expected, because it carried no explanation, no defense, no attempt to impress, only truth, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, a faint shift in his posture betraying the weight of something unspoken, before he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, holding it between two fingers for a brief moment before offering it to her, not as a command, not as an expectation, but as an option. "If you ever decide you would rather be heard before things go wrong," he said, his voice steady, "call me." And Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes clear, and for a second, it seemed as if she might decline, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty, and that possibility alone made Jonathan pause, because he was not used to offering something that might not be taken, and yet he did not withdraw his hand. He simply waited, and after a moment, Emily reached out and accepted the card, her fingers brushing it lightly, careful, deliberate, before placing it into the pocket of her apron without looking down, and the gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it carried a quiet finality, not an agreement, not a promise, just a choice made in her own time, on her own terms, and Jonathan nodded once more, a subtle acknowledgement of that, before stepping back, giving her space again, the same space she had always occupied, but that no longer felt invisible, and as he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time, not at the room, not at the deal, but at the woman who had changed both without ever raising her voice, and for the first time in a long time, he left without the feeling that he had been the one in control of everything that mattered. The hallway returned to its usual rhythm within minutes, the quiet efficiency of service replacing the weight of decisions that had just reshaped millions of dollars, and Emily Carter moved through it without pause, collecting cups, straightening chairs, resetting the room as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, because for her, the work had never been about recognition. It had always been about precision, about doing what was needed, and then stepping back before anyone thought to ask why. And yet the card in her apron pocket carried a presence she could not ignore, not heavy, not intrusive, just there, a reminder of a moment that had shifted something she had carefully kept contained, and she did not reach for it, not yet, because she understood the difference between opportunity and timing was something she did not rush, while across the city, several floors above a skyline that never seemed to rest, Jonathan Blake stood by the window of his office, the signed contract resting on the desk behind him, untouched since he had returned, because his attention was not on the numbers, not on the headlines that would follow, but on the quiet disruption that had rewritten the outcome before it ever became public, and he replayed it, not the deal itself, but the moment it almost failed, the exact second when the words had gone wrong, when the room had begun to turn, and then the voice that had corrected it, calm, certain, without hesitation. And what unsettled him was not that she had been right. It was that she had been precise, and precision at that level did not come from chance. It came from training, from experience, from a path that did not align with the uniform she wore. And he turned from the window, his mind already moving, not impulsively, but deliberately, the way it always did when something did not fit. And within minutes, a quiet instruction was given, not loud, not urgent, just enough to set things in motion, because Jonathan Blake did not ignore variables he did not understand, and Emily Carter had become exactly that. While back at the restaurant, the shift continued, orders called, plates carried, conversations blurred into background sound, and Emily remained part of that rhythm, her focus steady, her movements unchanged, but something in her awareness had sharpened, not because of the card, but because of what it represented, a door, not open, not closed, simply there, waiting, and when the rush slowed, just slightly, she stepped into the small break room at the end of the hall, the kind of space no one stayed in longer than necessary. And for the first time since the meeting, she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the card, holding it between her fingers as if weighing more than its surface, her eyes scanning the name, the number, the simplicity of it. And for a moment, the room felt still, not silent, but separate, like a pause between decisions, and she did not smile, she did not frown, she simply looked, thoughtful, measured, before turning the card once in her hand and placing it back into her pocket with the same calm intention, because whatever came next would not be decided in a moment like this, not rushed, not influenced by surprise, but chosen, deliberately, the same way she had chosen to speak when it mattered. And as she stepped back into the hallway, returning to the flow of work, nothing about her changed on the surface, the same quiet presence, the same steady pace, the same role everyone expected her to play, but beneath that, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, just enough to mark the beginning of a different direction, one that did not demand attention, but would not be ignored again, not by the people who had been in that room, and certainly not by the man who now understood that the most valuable insight he had almost lost that day had come from the one person he had not even thought to see. The next morning did not announce itself with anything unusual, no dramatic shift, no visible sign that something had already begun to change. Just the same early lights slipping between buildings, the same quiet hum of a city waking up, and inside the restaurant, Emily Carter tied her apron with the same steady hands, her movements unhurried, precise, as if routine itself was a kind of discipline she chose to maintain. Because control, for her, did not come from titles or positions, it came from consistency, from knowing exactly who she was regardless of where she stood. And she stepped onto the floor just as the first customers arrived, her expression calm, her focus clear, the card still resting in her pocket, untouched, not forgotten, simply not yet acted upon. While across town, in an office where decisions rarely waited, Jonathan Blake did not begin his day with meetings, not immediately. Instead, he sat at his desk, a thin file placed neatly in front of him, not thick, not extensive, just enough to confirm what instinct had already suggested. And he opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning the lines quickly, efficiently, but slowing just slightly at certain details that did not align with the role she played. Advanced coursework in linguistics, international exchange programs, a record that spoke of capability, of direction, of someone who had once been moving towards something very different, and then a sudden stop, an absence of continuation, as if the path had simply ended without explanation. And Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the file closing softly in his hands, because this was the part he understood best, not the success, not the visible achievements, but the interruption, the unseen shift that forced someone to step away from what they were capable of becoming. And that recognition settled into a quiet decision, not impulsive, not driven by curiosity alone, but by something more precise, the understanding that value did not always present itself where it was expected, and when it did not, it was often overlooked until it was too late, and he was not someone who allowed that to happen twice. And back at the restaurant, the morning moved forward with its usual rhythm, orders placed, coffee poured, conversations blending into a steady background, and Emily moved through it all with the same quiet awareness. But there was a subtle difference now, not in how she worked, but in how she was seen. A glance held a second longer, a pause before someone spoke to her, as if the memory of the previous day lingered just beneath the surface for those who had been there, and she noticed it, not with discomfort, but with clarity, understanding that attention, once given, could not be entirely taken back, and she did not seek it, did not respond to it. She simply continued, the same measured pace, the same calm presence, because her value had never depended on being recognized. And as the morning edged toward noon, the door opened again, not with urgency, not with spectacle, but with quiet intent, and Jonathan Blake stepped inside, not as the man from the boardroom, not carrying the weight of a billion-dollar deal, but as someone returning to a moment that had not yet fully concluded. And he did not look around the room as others did. He did not assess the space or the people within it. His attention moved directly, deliberately, until it found her. And for the briefest moment, before either of them spoke, there was a pause, not of hesitation, but of understanding, because some conversations do not begin with words, they begin with the recognition that something has already changed. Jonathan Blake did not slow his steps as he approached her, but something in his presence was different, not the sharp authority that had filled the boardroom, but a quieter intention, controlled yet deliberate, and Emily Carter noticed it immediately. Not because she was watching for him, but because she had learned to read the space around her long before anyone thought to read her. And when he stopped a few feet from her station, there was no audience, no executives, no pressure of a deal, just the soft clatter of dishes in the background and the low murmur of morning conversations. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of uncertainty, but because the weight of what had already happened did not require immediate words. And Jonathan was the first to break the silence, his voice even, measured. "You did not call," he said, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating a fact, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unchanged. "I did not," she replied, her tone steady, and the simplicity of that answer carried more clarity than any explanation could have offered, because it was not avoidance, it was choice, and Jonathan nodded slightly. as if acknowledging something he had already expected, before continuing. I looked into your background, he said, not as a threat, not as a revelation, but as a continuation of his nature. Precise, thorough, and Emily did not react, not with discomfort, not with defense. She only listened, because she understood the kind of man he was, the kind who did not leave questions unanswered, and he studied her for a moment longer before adding, "You were not meant to stay here." And there was no judgment in his voice, only observation, and Emily's lips curved just slightly, not dismissive, not impressed, just aware. "People end up where they are needed," she said quietly, and again. The answer did not argue, did not explain, it simply existed, complete on its own terms. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady, because this was not the conversation he usually had, not one where control came easily, not one where the outcome was predictable, and that alone held his attention more than anything else. And he stepped slightly closer, not intruding, but closing the distance just enough to make his next words clear. "I am not offering you a job," he said, his tone deliberate. "I am offering you a position where your voice is heard before it is needed to fix something." And the distinction hung in the air, subtle but intentional, because he understood now that what she had was not just skill, it was timing, judgment, awareness, and those things could not be trained into someone who did not already possess them. And Emily listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of thought, because this was not a moment that required speed, it required clarity, and the seconds stretched just enough to carry that weight before she finally spoke, her voice calm, unwavering. "You noticed me when something went wrong," she said, not as a criticism, but as a truth, and Jonathan did not look away, because he understood exactly what she meant, and she continued, just as quietly, "But I have always been this person." And that was the difference, the line that separated opportunity from recognition, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, not because it stopped, but because it no longer mattered, and Jonathan held her gaze, not searching for a response, not trying to persuade, but understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone. And for the first time in a long time, he did not fill the silence, he allowed it, because some answers were not given, they were chosen. Jonathan Blake did not respond immediately, not because he lacked words, but because for once, he understood that the moment did not belong to him to control, and Emily Carter did not look away, her gaze steady, not challenging, not yielding, simply present, and the space between them held something neither of them tried to rush, because what had been said could not be undone, and what had been seen could not be unseen. And after a few seconds, Jonathan gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, the kind that came when a truth landed exactly where it was meant to. "Then I was late," he said quietly, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only clarity, and that alone shifted something, subtle but real, because men like him were not known for admitting timing, only outcomes, and Emily noticed it, not with surprise, but with understanding, because recognition did not always arrive when it should, and that did not make it less real, only later than expected, and she glanced briefly toward the dining room, where another table had just been seated, the rhythm of her work calling her back, steady and familiar, and when she looked at him again, her expression had not changed, but her decision had settled, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be clear. "If I come," she said, her voice calm, measured, "it will not be because you need me to fix something." And Jonathan listened without interruption, his attention fully on her now, because he understood that this was not negotiation, this was definition, and she continued, "It will be because I choose where my voice belongs." And the words did not rise, did not push, they simply held their ground. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant returned around them, the quiet clatter of plates, the low hum of conversation, the ordinary world continuing exactly as it had before, and Jonathan let the silence follow her statement, not filling it, not adjusting it, because he recognized the weight of it, and after a second, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture smaller than most would notice, but precise in its meaning. "Then I will make sure it belongs there," he replied, not as a promise, not as persuasion, but as intention, and Emily studied him for a brief moment, not searching for certainty, but measuring something less visible, something in the way he held the space now, without interruption, without assumption, and whatever she found, it was enough, not to decide everything, but to decide the next step, and she nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, before stepping back, not away from him, but back into her role, her place, her rhythm, and Jonathan did not follow. He did not reach out. He simply watched as she turned, picking up a notepad, greeting the next table with the same calm presence she had always carried, as if nothing about her had changed, and yet everything about how she was seen had. And he stood there for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because the deal he had closed the day before would be remembered in numbers, in headlines, in outcomes. But what stayed with him was something else entirely, something quieter, something harder to measure, the understanding. That value did not announce itself, it revealed itself, often in the moments most people overlooked, and as he turned to leave, the city moving around him as it always did, he did not check his phone, he did not review the contract again, because for once, the most important thing he had gained was not written down anywhere, and inside the restaurant, Emily moved from table to table, her voice soft, her presence steady, exactly as it had always been, but no longer invisible, not to him, and not to herself, because some voices do not need to be raised to be heard, they only need the right moment to be recognized, and when that moment comes, it does not change who they are, it reveals who they have always been.